So hi, everyone. Welcome to the segment where we're featuring what we think are one of the best healthcare investors globally. I'm super excited to be talking with Harris. He's an investor and chief medical officer at SpringTide Ventures. Harris, thank you so much for taking the time. I really appreciate it.
Oh, of course, I'm happy to be here.
I'm actually super excited to be talking with you. A couple different reasons. SpringTide Ventures, phenomenal fund, especially in the healthcare space. Wanted to highlight you guys as one of the top healthcare venture investors globally. And we're going to get into some of your investment thesis. You also have a pretty unique background and a lot of unique experience that you brought to SpringTide Ventures, and I want to jump into that as well. But to give the audience a baseline, let's start off with just the function of who is SpringTide Ventures, what is the fund, what is the, what kind of assets you have under management, what are you looking for? Let's just start with the baseline. Who is SpringTide Ventures?
So SpringTide Ventures, SpringTide Capital Management is a venture capital fund started about 2 years ago by 3 Harvard Business School graduates who are entrepreneurs. I joined them about a year ago. We invest in startups that are using artificial intelligence to disrupt the healthcare space. And that's a very broad thesis, but it leaves us lots of freedom to pick very exciting companies to help. We're all working on the same underlying fundamentals and mission, which is to enable technology to solve the healthcare problems that exist in our country today. And not just here, but also worldwide. We're firm believers that as these problems are solved and reduce the cost of providing care, that will spread throughout the world, and that's part of SpringTide's mission. We have about $15 million under management right now. We've made about 18 investments. We're continuing to pick exciting startups. We are going to close out Fund 1 here in about 3 months, and plans are to move on to Fund 2 after an appropriate period of time. Very cool.
Well, I'm curious about how you jumped into venture, because a short snip of your background, orthopedic surgeon, mechanical engineer, you were U.S. Navy submarine officer. Now you're starting to do your MBA. Why venture? What's going on here?
So for me, life is about adding value to the organizations I participate with and intellectual challenge. And so I can't say that I planned my story the way that it's turned out, but I can say that I'm extraordinarily happy with it. And I think part of that is just keeping the freedom to pivot when the need arises to maintain those two goals. So initially, I have a strong desire to serve public. The military provided that advantage. The military provided advantages and growth opportunities that I never would have foreseen. You get extraordinary responsibility early in your career. You get to deal with cutting edge technology. You have responsibility that I just don't see elsewhere for people below 25 years old. So that was a great forming event for me. Decided to move on after about 5 years. Went to medical school. Path to orthopedic surgery, absolutely loved it. The mechanical part of my brain was fully satisfied by that. Helping people, again, was fantastic. Intellectually challenging for a very long time. Discovered during the time I was growing my practice in Austin, Texas, that I also had a significant interest in, and I believe ability for management. And as I began to run a larger and larger organization and help hospitals in medical leadership, those became the challenges that I was interested in. And I got to see lots of the problems that exist in healthcare. Time came when that need for new intellectual stimulation arose, and venture capital really is a natural transition from that. Both the experience I have from healthcare, seeing those problems, and then the desire that I have to remedy those problems. I get to look at hundreds of companies and entrepreneurs that are starting to solve those things, pick the ones that we think are going to do best, and then enable them with investment and management assistance to accomplish that mission. And so can't say I planned it this way, but I couldn't be happier with the way it worked out.
Well, I mean, I'm sure SpringTide Ventures is very lucky to have you part of the team, because you have such a unique experience and background. And I think probably the perfect man for the job, especially taking on a problem within healthcare investing, having been a provider, having been, an engineer, you're a triple threat. But I want to jump in. Yeah, I want to jump in to your investment thesis at SpringTide Ventures. And you talked in the beginning about how your fund is focused on AI applications in healthcare. AI, as you kind of alluded to, can be kind of broad, gives you a lot of flexibility. What does this actually mean? What kind of requirements does you have of a lot of companies you work with? Do they have to have some component of machine learning? Do they have to analyze or have some form of data set that they can leverage? I mean, how do you piece through what are AI companies and what are not AI companies?
I think we keep it deliberately broad on purpose, and I'll narrow it down in a moment. But part of the reason for that is just limiting ourselves to healthcare goes against diversifying for risk. We believe healthcare, and particularly digital applications to healthcare, are going to experience extraordinary growth over the next 5 to 10 years. If we narrow it further, we feel we increase our risk further. So we like the idea of diversifying within the healthcare space, but limiting that to companies really using technology, specifically artificial intelligence, to innovate and democratize healthcare. And so that's how the thesis came about. And I have to give credit to Austin Walters, one of our managing partners, who is a disciple of the innovation and Clayton Christensen line of thinking. He actually spent a lot of time with him at Harvard Business School. And that's really the origin of the thesis. And then it was a lot of putting our heads together and narrowing that. But by reducing the cost and eliminating the barriers that exist to care through the use of technology, and we'll talk a little bit about why artificial intelligence is the ideal technology for healthcare, we're able to provide, we believe people will be able to receive healthcare services in a much different model than exists today. And that will expand access, it will reduce cost, but at the same time be very profitable for those entities that create that. So that was the origin of the idea. It continues to evolve, and we'll have to expand further.
Cool. Well, I mean, you kind of, again, you talked a little bit about it, even having, AI as a general focus in healthcare. Healthcare is tough. It's a vast industry. There's a lot of companies. This is probably one of the hardest industries in comparison to many other categories that we've looked at. How do you filter this down? I mean, are you starting with a specific disease, a specific issue, or are you just looking at, types of services that exist in tool sets? Like, how do you structure this? And then how do you focus in on those companies that are valuable for your portfolio or for your fund?
I hear two questions in there. So I'll start with the first, which is the statement that healthcare is tough. And yes, it is in many regards, but it is ripe for innovation. All of the time that I've spent in healthcare, the level of optimization that exists about the delivery of healthcare services is fairly low. And so if you look at an industry that is ripe for disruption and can undergo a transformation to providing services at reduced cost, healthcare is it. Next might be education. So when we look at healthcare entities that are trying to acquire new companies and new technologies, the sales cycle is not as long as one typically thinks for healthcare because the value proposition is so great. The idea of reducing costs by 80%, and I'll give you an example of Pathology Watch, a company we've invested in, it answers itself. And so when you look at selling to providers as one of our portfolio companies, that volume of savings shortens that sales cycle. To go into a little more detail, Pathology Watch is a company using artificial intelligence to automate the diagnosis of skin cancers using AI. So they have taken over the entire production cycle for dermatology clinics, meaning the old way was dermatology clinics would have a dermatopathologist on staff. They would process tissue, they would examine it under the microscope, they would generate their own reports, and then they would send bills for their services. Now, you can imagine using individual physicians for that can be quite expensive. The vision that Pathology Watch has and that they've implemented is the tissue actually gets sent right to Pathology Watch's lab. It gets processed at scale, so the cost goes down. It gets imaged at scale, so all of the imaging is digital, can be passed back to the originating pathologist without cost. And then it gets processed and read by artificial intelligence. And if you think about something that is truly pattern recognition and truly meant for AI as opposed to general intelligence, it's looking at pathology slides and radiology images. It's repetitive work. The idea of having a computer do that, you'll have lower errors. The idea of mixing in augmented intelligence where you have definitive negatives, definitive positives, and then occasionally the AI will identify a gray read, and passing that up to an experienced dermatopathologist, you increase your accuracy drastically, you reduce your cost by about 80%. Sure, you're going to get less reimbursement from payers due to their understanding that that reduced cost exists, but the scale provides increased revenue overall. And so when you pitch that to a dermatology clinic, the end result is a quick sale and quick implementation. And that's why we're seeing such rapid growth at Pathology Watch.
Interesting. Really interesting. And it makes sense. And great company, by the way. Great investment.
We agree.
I mean, SpringTide is an early stage venture fund. And this is tough. I mean, you talked about how there's a lot of innovation. But there's there's a lot of filtering of a lot of companies that exist in this category, and just for healthcare software alone, being an early stage investor in healthcare, does this mean when you look at companies, are you looking at companies to be moonshots or extremely disruptive, or are you looking more at something that is practical, that can be implemented today, that's not going to shift the paradigm of healthcare services, but just something that providers or clinicians or patients or payers could use?
A little bit of both, kind of a hybrid. So we definitely look for companies that are trying to solve problems within 3 parameters. So there's got to be a problem that needs to be solved. It's got to be a need. There's got to be a technical solution that's likely to work. And then finally, there has to be people willing to pay for that solution. And so when you talk about moonshots, what I think of is things that may or may not work. You invest a lot of resources. These are mostly government projects. You invest a lot of resources. You develop side technology from that, but the main idea may or may not work out. I don't think that accurately describes what we're looking for. On the other hand, we're also not looking for steady state businesses that are going to grow slowly and not change the world. And so Pathology Watch is one example. Tula Health is another example. Tula is a company that is assessing patients' responses to management of chronic disease, specifically diabetes, using technology to do that, incorporating lots of communication with patients, both from real people and from AI managed chatbots and such, to attempt to change human behavior in a way that will drastically lower healthcare costs throughout America and throughout the world. And so I look at that as much more likely to work than a moonshot, but also not something that is that is a continuous revenue generating, more something that's going to grow and change everything. So right down the middle.
Interesting. It makes sense. It feels like there's a lot of times there's a sweet spot of finding a mix of companies that are disruptive enough, that are going to really change how either health is managed or workflows of providers, but at the same time is something that you can actually implement, today.
And we also have a mission to our limited partners in that we do believe in the venture capital model of finding true winners that are going to reward our investors. And if we were just investing in steady state companies, it would be much harder to accomplish that mission. So we really are looking for companies that are going to experience explosive growth, but balancing that with having technical problems that we believe can be solved.
Interesting. And you could have already talked about it, and we might be repeating ourselves a few times, but I really want to highlight this because this is kind of the foundation of the fund itself too, which is you talked about that you identified that there's a huge need for digital services or digital solutions in healthcare. There's a wide gap, and healthcare might seem difficult, but that is the big opportunity. And so what do you see that most people don't in the healthcare industry, and how does that shape your investment thesis?
Well, and I like the question because you're giving me the opportunity to go back and explain why we don't narrow down to one subset of healthcare as well. And the answer there again is diversification. We think the opportunities to improve healthcare delivery exist across the board throughout the healthcare space. So the more variable our investments are within healthcare, the more we'll be able to find opportunity, the increased likelihood of finding opportunities. So the way, and my apologies, come back, you had asked about, from there, it was how do we narrow down into those opportunities that are going to be successful? That was the question?
Yeah, I guess, yeah, in some sense, it's, what are you seeing that most people don't when investing in healthcare or the healthcare industry?
Well, that's where our team comes in. So SpringTide is really a combination of entrepreneurs and deliverers of healthcare services in the past, so that as a team, we're able to see the various facets. And we've been in the situation where we've been the customers for the for our portfolio companies, or the types of customers our portfolio companies are seeking. So with me as a physician and an engineer, with Dan Lambert as a software engineer who's created several startups, Austin Walters and his fractional sales experience, and Giannis, who has created biologic technologies that fit with selling to the same types of providers that our startups are selling to. So that really lets us, we think, pick the winners and those that we don't think are going to have quite the success. And then you add in our network of limited partners, which consists of physicians, entrepreneurs, investors, and we often will get external opinions from them. And it leads to a collaborative, what we feel is very successful decision-making process.
Yeah, I think your team's experience is phenomenal, and it's internally. I just feel as though you guys have a clear understanding of how the entire ecosystem works. It makes it so much easier for you to say what works, what doesn't, what are the companies you should focus on. Incredible. Jumping into your portfolio, before we talk about and highlight some of them, but I'm curious, when you are as a healthcare investor. You cover a lot of different categories of digital health. Do you find that when you invest in a particular company, let's say it's in the telemedicine category, or you talk about imagery, do you think that kind of can be limiting sometimes? You make it, once you invest in one category, it sets the limits off limits for the rest, or is there enough opportunities where you're not even worried about this problem?
Not worried about that. The opportunities are, nearly infinite. We do, once we invest in a space and invest in a particular company, feel an obligation to help them succeed, both with our money, but also with our experience and our network. And so we do try to avoid multiple investments in the exact same space. We would not want to invest in two companies that are competitors. On the other hand, what we're finding is that by picking such wonderful portfolio companies, they're actually referring synergistic companies to us. And we're then able to invest in companies that have synergies between them and can help each other to succeed. So it's not uncommon for one of our portfolio companies to reach out and ask to have a meeting with another in order to find opportunities they can pursue jointly.
Interesting. And it definitely makes sense. I think, going back on your portfolio, you actually already highlighted some of your portfolio companies and what makes them extremely valuable, especially Pathology Watch that you mentioned in the beginning, how that as a company makes perfect sense to integrate directly into providers' workflow. Is there any other companies that you might want to highlight in your portfolio that, perhaps why you made those investments or what makes them unique?
Of course, and I think by illustrating a few, that will show you both the diversity and the advantages of appealing to different customers for those portfolios. So another I'd like to talk about is Bioscia, fascinating company started by infectious disease experts. They have new technology that can identify bacteria in minutes to hours, as opposed to the old methodology of using cultures, which takes days and goes back 100 years or more since we developed that. But the exciting part of that is not just the rapid acquisition of information, but the use of AI to detect trends faster than people can do this. And so to give you an example, all of the hospitals that I worked out throughout my medical career have a quarterly or sometimes monthly meeting of infectious disease experts to review all of the infections that have come up and try to identify trends to look for resistant bacteria and things that will cause many patients in those facilities to have problems. And it's an important mission. It's a valuable mission. It's a very valuable skill that the infectious disease physicians bring. But think about the advantage of having an AI-based system look at your results, your culture results, or your bacterial results in real time and flagging potential outbreaks moments after the data comes back in instead of once a month or once every 3 months. And so you get to respond so much quicker. And the value add there for facilities is fantastic. That, again, that reduces that long sales cycle that typically exists in healthcare. So wonderful company doing wonderful things. Next one I could talk about is radiant oximetry. This is the brainchild of an anesthesiologist who looked at the number of C-sections being done and looked at the information being processed by obstetricians in order to make the decision whether or not to proceed with a C-section. So if you're not familiar with this, looking at a fetal heart rate tracing, which has been around for 30, 40 years, probably more, it's an ultrasound that measures the heart rate of the child before being born. Every time there's a contraction in the mother, the heart rate will dip. Well, did it dip too much? Is that normal? Is that the fetus in distress? Do you have to rush to the operating room and perform an emergency surgery or not? It's really an art and a science to making that call at the current time. Well, Neil Ray, the founder of Radiant, was sitting in the operating room watching this and realizing there's got to be a better way. And with his own funds, went out, hired an optical engineer to develop a device that measures the oxygenation, not just in the mother's blood, but in the fetus's blood. And so instead of looking at the change in fetal heart rate, he's now looking at the actual content of oxygen in the baby's blood. And when that dips, he knows that's fetal distress immediately, as opposed to having to guess. And we believe that company is going to reduce the number of unnecessary C-sections done out of concern for the mother and child by 70, 80%. In addition, there's good evidence to say that that's going to reduce the missed episodes of fetal distress by 50%. And so you're going to do more appropriate C-sections and you're going to do fewer C-sections that didn't need to be done, not because of the malintent of the providers, but because of lack of good data. Using AI to assess that fetal oxygenation trace improves the accuracy and eventually will cause alarms to go off much quicker for those obstetricians so missed opportunities don't occur. And it's companies like that that really inspire us to continue to help people.
I kind of want to build off of that because I feel like the healthcare industry is so unique when working with a lot of founders. A lot of times they have a personal background. They might be affected by it. They might be in that workflow. Sometimes these are life or death situations in which they're trying to solve. Other times it could end up being serious issues. At the same time, sometimes it tends to be both a hardware and a software and, a business model regulation problem. And all of that is just, it's really impressive to see a lot of these founders build companies like this. It's truly incredible.
We agree. And one thing that I left out earlier was one of our key criteria for investing in a company is belief in the founding team. They have to either have a fantastic idea they have to have a fantastic idea. They have to have pursued it effectively, but it also, to be able to inspire us with confidence due to past performance or vision for the future is essential.
Yeah. To kind of echo that too, it feels like, you almost have to have a really deep reason why you're building some of these companies in order to go through that challenge that exists in the healthcare industry. And speaking of challenges, it feels like, especially for healthcare software, and we talked about this a little bit in the beginning, it just seems like the sentiment, and it's notoriously known that healthcare software has much longer sales cycles. It's hard to sell to providers. It's a little more, it's a lot more difficult to startups, it seems like, get off the ground and get to sustainability. And I'm just curious, what is your perspective on this? Does this change your approach? I mean, you kind of mentioned earlier, value exists, providers are going to take it, sales cycles drop, but I'm just curious about this general sentiment about healthcare software.
So it's not what we're seeing. It exists. It's longer than when you have decision making occurring in other industries, but we're able to mitigate the risk of that through the companies that we're picking. And so I'll use two companies as examples. One would be Radiant, which we just talked about, and fetal oximetry. They did a study of what hospital CFOs would be willing to pay for this device. And it wouldn't be appropriate for me to reveal the details. However, it amazed me in the due diligence process that how high that willingness to pay was because of the value being added by this device. This is saving lives. It's saving money for facilities. It's enhancing the value provided by the facilities. And so the sales conversation is much easier when you're not talking about marginal gains, but when you're talking about game-changing technologies. People want to be involved in that. They want to incorporate that in their hospital. Another example would be WellSheet. WellSheet is a fantastic company out of Boston. What WellSheet does is takes information from the electronic health record and predicts which subsets of information physicians are going to want to see when they log into the EHR, shows it to them in a format that is what they're expecting to see and makes them much more efficient. I'm not sure how, one of the biggest problems with current health record technology is physicians can't stand using it. It's too much information. The nuggets that you need are way deep into the software. You're constantly having to click to find them. So instead of I started on paper charts and evolved to electronic medical records. The paper charts were faster. There's no other industry where we think, wow, I wish I could go back to paper. And I don't miss the paper. I just miss the paper relative to what we're dealing with now. Well, when you look at technologies like WellSheet and others that we're looking at, they change those comments from physicians. So it's kind of a funny story. In part of our due diligence for WellSheet, I ended up on the phone with the chief medical officer for the hospital where I was born. I've since moved elsewhere. That happens to be one of their customers, and it really cracked me up. But listening to the enthusiasm on the part of this physician, not just for himself, but for the physicians he represents, they now log into the computer and they see what they want to see faster than flipping through paper instead of slower. And so this is an overlay on Epic. This is an overlay on other existing systems. So there's nothing to implement in terms of, there's no long-term implementation from an IT point of view. You just get immediate physician happiness, immediate utility, and you get, for the hospital, you get physicians from other facilities that are going to start coming over to your facility because it's more convenient to work there. So that greatly reduces the sales cycle for healthcare. And so we're seeing that with WellSheet as well also.
Interesting. And I think this goes back to attributing to your team's experience and your focus as well, and being able to identify companies that can kind of move past those hurdles that you traditionally see in healthcare. I feel like I'm just curious, because this is always a big topic, because healthcare, there's so many companies and there's a variety of different categories, a lot of different tools to solve problems. How do you know what is the right tool to manage a health issue, whether it's specific like diabetes, broad for any type of chronic condition? And by tool, I mean, is it a mobile application? Are we talking devices? Is it telemedicine services? Does it come directly from a provider management application? How do you know what is the right tool and for health management or managing any form of health? And I assume it's a pretty broad question because there's a lot of different health verticals, so it's hard to answer. But
it is, and the answer is evolving. So part of it is experience. Part of it is having watched patients over the course of 20 years of medicine. You get a feeling for what people are going to respond to and what they aren't going to respond to. And so, and part of it is psychology. If you're dealing with changing patient behavior, a lot of it is psychology, but you really get exposed to that aspect. I like to think about these things I'll go off topic for a moment, but I'll come back to it. I like to think about this in terms of my views on smoking cessation when I was a practicing physician. I saw hundreds of patients a week, and a fair number of them were still using tobacco. And you would offer them the opportunity to help them stop. you could tell within 5 or 10 seconds which people were interested and which weren't. And there's really good evidence to say that your time is best spent on that small subset that are open to the idea or contemplative about making that change. And once you identify that someone is in that contemplative state instead of pre-contemplative, well, then go with all your effort at contemplative. Your efforts are best focused on those people thinking about quitting, as opposed to those who aren't even willing to consider it. So that's where all of these tools come in. What's going to predict where a clinician's best efforts are spent making change in healthcare? And so I think that's what you're seeing in many of these companies that are looking at chronic disease and how to manage that. That's Tula. When you take all of this information in from patients and you look for pattern recognition, you'll be able to detect those people who are contemplative about making a change and focus on them, and then continue to search for more people who are pre-contemplative and try little interventions to get them to move to that contemplative state. A little bit off exactly what you asked, but one of the things that we look at in terms of changing human behavior and saving the healthcare system lots of money.
No, it's an interesting example that you give, especially going back in time and talking about smoking issues. And I think this is one of the difficult parts of another caveat of the difficulties of healthcare is how much psychology goes behind actually trying to get people to want to do something with their health. And like you said, changing behavior is not easy. It's not like you could throw a simple tool up, fee for service kind of. It's really difficult to get people to move on some health issues they've been dealing for a while.
Well, it's not that anybody doesn't want to do something with their own health. It's that people have priorities. People want to be healthy, but people want to enjoy certain aspects of life as well. And those don't always, there's a Venn diagram there without complete overlap. And so it's just a matter of helping people to see the choices that are best for them.
Interesting. Well, when looking at your portfolio, it seems like you tend to focus on software that might be a little bit more specific to the conditions versus, say, platform that can be used for a variety of different type of patients or a variety of different conditions or issues. Why do you guys skew towards more specific health management care or care applications versus something that might be a little bit more broader?
You had asked that in our earlier conversation, and I feel that we are a little more broad than that. So we do have some companies that are looking at behavior change. Tool is my example that comes right to mind. Others that are trying to change clinician decision making, like Radiant, which we discussed, and Wellsheet. We've also invested in Fremont Scientific, which they've made a new way of getting blood to people and getting that blood to the right temperature before you put it in. So it's more, for us, it's more about process improvement, whether or not those processes are how we manage patient behavior or how we manage internal processes within a hospital, or the processes for physicians to get information into and out of a medical record. We're looking across the board at process improvement. So not necessarily limited to chronic disease management or patient behavior.
Interesting. Makes sense. Now I want to shift gears a little bit to more kind of broader questions for the healthcare ecosystem.
Great.
And then we'll end on some of the unique aspects that I wanted to really highlight about SpringTide. The big elephant in the room is obviously the pandemic. And I'm just curious, how do you think the pandemic has changed the outlook of healthcare, and what shifts do you think are going to happen?
So we try to look at that in two ways. First, the pandemic is creating huge amounts of change and anxiety. However, it won't be here forever. And so long-term investment decisions are best made based upon the fundamental problems that exist. And the pandemic is fortunately temporary. That being said, it has really changed people's views of technology. Look at what we're doing today. We're having an interview without meeting, and it feels natural. I have Zoom meetings all day long, and in some ways I prefer them to in-person meetings. We're more focused. There's not interruptions and other people around. And so in the same way that the pandemic has caused this kind of interaction to become more useful and more and better tolerated by people. That's occurring with in many other aspects of medicine. So physical therapy can be administered through virtual reality or through telemedicine type solutions. Patients, it's interesting. I think patients' expectations for telemedicine they've always been willing to tolerate. They would have loved it if physicians would have been more open to the idea of telemedicine. I think physicians were closed to it because they thought it wouldn't be as accurate or as there'd be more liability. There'd be less of that patient-doctor relationship that we all crave. But having the pandemic force physicians into providing services in this way, I'm starting to hear doctors say that and mid-levels start to say that they enjoy doing this. It makes them more efficient. They can help more people. So it's made both sides of that interaction more tolerant. I can't imagine that's not going to continue. I think a lot of it has to do with payment models that are set up and some factors there. But we've all become tolerant to technology guiding these interactions that we used to not be tolerant of. So I think those changes are at least in part permanent. I think the same applies to some of the behavior modification things that we talked about. Are people going to tolerate an AI chatbot reminding them to take their diabetes medication? I think yes. However, if it's done right, I think technology can be creepy, technology can be enabling, and so as long as we avoid the creepy aspect of it, the tolerance of patients and clinicians and managers for accepting the advantages and disadvantages of these technologies has really changed due to COVID, and I think that will only continue.
Interesting. It's such a unique position for the healthcare industry in this particular setting, and it seems as though there's a silver lining in the sense that it really kind of highlights a lot of the bottlenecks and is pushing a lot of, like you mentioned, different types of behaviors, both from providers but also from the patients as well, in a direction that seems pretty positive. So it's really unique time to be in.
You also have to think about it from the provider role in the hospital, and what you have to, I think, divide providers into clinicians and then entities that are providing services. And so I think hospitals are very different than clinicians, but they do have in common that they have these large regulatory barriers to progress. And they're also protected by some of these barriers, and so incentivizing them to take the risk of exploring the limits of the regulatory barriers and to take the risk of breaking down their moats to other people providing the same services requires both incentives in the term of in how they're paid, but also I think when people stopped showing up at the doctor's office and at the hospital, that gave them the incentive to step into these markets that will only allow us to further democratize all of these services.
Interesting. Well, with that, I getting close to the end of time here, but I wanted to really highlight SpringTide Ventures, because one of the reasons why, having this interview and chatting with you, Harris, is not only have such incredible insights and perspective on the healthcare industry, but you guys take it one step further. I mean, you're an active healthcare venture investor. You are active with your portfolio. You have a fantastic portfolio, but you have some really unique aspects of portfolio development that I don't see any other healthcare venture investor doing. You have a sales program, if I'm not mistaken. Can you highlight what this is and what makes that? So why is it important probably for portfolio companies?
Yes, well, it's important for startups to begin with, and that's where the idea came from. So again, I have to give credit to Austin Walters. So fractional sales is a wonderful way for early stage companies to have the advantages of an experienced sales force without the expense. There's no way they can hire a team nationwide of salespeople who can do a good job acquiring customers. And so Austin had the idea to build a company that takes these stellar salespeople around the country, creates a network, and allows them to focus part-time on many different companies instead of being full-time employed by one company. And so that idea in itself took off and was effective. But then with the initiation of SpringTide and the need of all of our portfolio companies for this service, we quickly realized that that synergy was a huge value add for people, for our investment portfolio. So the fractional sales force was folded into the venture capital fund, and it's something we do to encourage stellar startups to consider us, and then to enhance their value once we're working with them. Right away, they have access to vast sales experience at costs far below what you see from larger companies.
You guys hit it right on the money. I mean, it's what the most important thing is, how do you sell more product? I mean, there is the mentorship portion. You guys got that covered. Great. You also have access to capital. Wonderful. But now you're able to provide them your own portfolio access to customers, which is huge. I mean, that's a really, really big, important aspect that I think really sets SpringTide Ventures apart. And I think the global healthcare venture funds. I mean, it's really impressive how you guys have been able to build that, manage that, and provide that for your portfolio. It's really awesome.
I appreciate you identifying it. It's very nice to see how that just works for all of our portfolio companies, and it's the same people, it's the same customers, and it's the same people selling to those customers. And so it's able to, as we add more portfolio companies, it's able to help more of them. I appreciate you recognizing that.
Something I think a lot of healthcare companies should be chatting with you guys for this. I mean, this is a huge support. Well, with that, Harris, that was all the questions I had. Thank you so much for taking the time to do this. Before I have closing remarks, did you have anything else that you want to announce, share with the audience, recap about SpringTide?
No. Well, we're a team I am very happy to continue to work with. They are. It has been. It's been a fantastic experience. If anyone is interested, either portfolio companies or potential investors, please reach out to me. No, I greatly appreciate the opportunity to do this, and I've greatly enjoyed the interview. Thank you.
Thanks, Harris. Well, with that, to recap, we looked at well over 140 individuals and venture investors globally, specifically in healthcare, and the funds that stood out to us was SpringTide Ventures, and especially Harris. I mean, your guys' strategy, your backgrounds, your portfolio, your approach, your portfolio development, your sales program. Phenomenal, fantastic, one of the best healthcare venture investors that exist on this planet. So thank you so much, Harris, for taking the time to do this. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Kyle. Thanks for having me.